and welcome to the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by me, Hannah Alvine. Ardent listeners of the Kalamopod will know that in the previous episodes I spoke quite a bit about the emergence of the science of Islamic theology, in Arabic called Kalam, and about the insistence of its practitioners, the mutakallimun, to scrutinize religious dogmas and to rest them on a rational foundation. We also heard that the science of Kalam was viewed with suspicion by more traditional scholars who were doubtful about the role of reason in deciding theological questions, and who instead claimed to base their theological positions exclusively on the Quran and the words of the Prophet. This sort of opposition against Kalam did certainly not stop the mutakallimun from practicing their science. And why should they have refrained from it when they believed that they had the Quran on their side? I mean, that the mutakallimun believed that it was the Quran itself that made frequent use of rational arguments in order to convince its audience, and that they were therefore fully justified in doing precisely the same thing. So, now the mutakallimun could go to work, and you can imagine that they found a host of religious problems which they could subject to rational investigation. The problems which they discussed ranged from the definition of knowledge and methods of proof to creation and the creator, God's attributes, prophethood, predestination and human agency, belief and unbelief, forms of governance, and so on. Over time, Kalam works became longer and longer, adding more and more intricate details to the discussions, engaging with the positions developed by varying schools, refuting them, and adding new forms of argument and proof. Still, Kalam works tended to follow the same essential structure and order. This reflects the fact that the arrangement was not random, but followed a certain logic. It made sense for the mutakallimun to speak first about the definition of knowledge and methods of proof, and then to move on to the actual proofs of religious dogmas. It also made sense to establish first all of God's attributes, and only then to move on to discussions about God's requirements for the leader of the Muslim community. In keeping with this logic of Kalam works, in today's episode of the Kalamopod, we want to have a closer look at the mutakallimun's discussion about creation and the creator. We will look at how the mutakallimun sought to prove, by means of rational argument, that the world is created and that God is its creator. And we want to understand what the mutakallimun actually meant when they said that the world is created and that God is its creator. So let us start by asking why it is that creation and the creator and the rational proofs associated with them were such a concern for the mutakallimun. There are several reasons for this. The most evident one is to be found in the Quran, Muslims' holy scripture, which was the starting point for many theological discussions. The Quran does not get tired to remind its audience time and again that the world was created by God. And here are some examples. In Surah 2, verse 117, the Quran describes God as, quote, creator of the heavens and the earth, Badiyu samawati wal ard. In Surah 10, verse 3, we read that, quote, your Lord is God who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. Inna rabbakumullahu alladhi khalaqa samawati wal arda bi sittati ayamin. And as a final example, in Surah 39, verse 62, the Quran declares, quote, God is the creator of all things. Allahu khaliqu kulli shay. So, you see, the Quran presents God's role as creator as one of its central tenets. Since this is the case, it comes as little surprise that the mutakallimun were quick to subject this tenet to their rational investigation and to discuss it in ever more detail in their Kalam works. Another reason why the proof of creation and the creator was such a concern for the mutakallimun is that they realized that to say that God created the world actually raises more questions than it answers. What I mean is that they realized that it was not so obvious what precisely the Quran wanted to say when it stressed that God created the world. So they felt the need to engage in discussing just what the Quran actually meant. What made the situation all the more complicated was that with the expansion of the Islamic Empire, the mutakallimun came into contact with adherents of other faiths who had their very own ideas of how the world came about and what God's role in creating the world was. And to make matters even more complicated, Islamic scholars were divided among themselves about this question. For example, the way in which the mutakallimun understood God's creation of the world stood in marked contrast to the way in which another group of scholars, namely Islamic philosophers, understood it. So you see, with all these different conceptions of God's creation of the world circulating, the mutakallimun really had something to puzzle their heads over. And they did in fact engage with these different conceptions in their works. Take as an example al-Maturidi's Kalam work entitled Kitab at-Tawhid, or the Book on God's Oneness. Al-Maturidi was a 10th century theologian from present-day Uzbekistan, and his name became associated with a theological school, the Maturidiyya. In his Kitab at-Tawhid, al-Maturidi has a chapter in which he lists a host of conceptions held by different groups, who, however, remain unidentified, of how God brought about the world, and here are some of them. One group believed that there was a time when only God existed and not the world, and then God brought the world into existence at some point in the past from nothing. Another group believed that God eternally creates the world, that God and the world have always existed together, but that the world would not exist if it were not for God's creation of it. Yet another group believed that the stuff and material which the world is made of has always existed, independent of God, and that God's creative activity only applies to giving the world its specific form and shape. So, while the mutakallimun were very much aware that different understandings of God's creation of the world existed, they were convinced that only one of them was in fact correct. They believed that what the Quran wanted to say when it called God the creator of the world was nothing else than the first option I just gave you. God is eternal, while the world has come into existence, and God created the world from nothing. It is this particular understanding of God's creation of the world which the mutakallimun set out to prove in their works by rational argument. So let us then have a look at some of the arguments they presented. Let us start with one work by the famous 10th century mutakallim AlAshari, whom we are already familiar with from the previous episode of the Kalamopod, as an ardent defender of the science of Kalam against its detractors and the founder of an important theological school. So in one of his works entitled Kitab al-Lumma, or the Radiant Book, AlAshari has a chapter in which he asks the question, what is the proof that there is a creator for creation? He then answers, and I'm quoting, "The proof is that the human being was once merely a drop of sperm, then became a blood clot, then flesh. We all know that the human being cannot transform himself from state to state. We see that the human being is first a child, then an adult, then an elderly person, and we all know that he does not transform himself from state to state, but that there is one who transforms him from state to state. AlAshari here presents a rather interesting argument. He draws an analogy between the transformation of humans from state to state and the changes which the whole world undergoes. Just as the transformation of humans depends on an external cause, so the changes in the whole world depend on an external cause, and that is God. In the subsequent chapter, AlAshari then makes the point that creation is not just dependent on God, but that God brought it about at a point in time in the past. He argues that the world must have entered existence since whatever is eternal cannot undergo change. But the world does undergo change, so it cannot be eternal. You may ask yourself what you make of AlAshari's argument, whether you find it a good argument to prove that the world depends on God, or whether AlAshari would have to make a greater effort to convince you. In any case, you can imagine that with time, the mutakallimun's arguments for creation and the creator became more and more intricate. But it was one particular argument that became the favorite argument of the mutakallimun, who would make frequent use of it in their works. This is what Islamic studies scholars came to call the argument from accidents. Basically, the argument from accidents runs like this, and brace yourself, this might get a little complicated. As a first step, the mutakallimun argued that the world entered existence at some point in the past, in order to then argue that it was God who created the world at that point in time. The mutakallimun asserted that the whole world is made of what they called atoms, in Arabic al-juz alladhi la yatajaza'u, which literally means the part that cannot be divided. These atoms are joined together to form bodies, in Arabic jism, which are basically the things you encounter in this world, like trees, humans, animals, and so on. In these bodies, we find all sorts of so-called accidents, in Arabic adad, which are all the characteristics of bodies, such as their color, their texture, and the states they are in, such as movement and rest, heat and cold. The mutakallimun now argued that these accidents come about in time. Sometimes a body might be in rest, and sometimes it might be in movement, so these accidents are definitely not eternal. As a next step, the mutakallimun argued that the bodies in which we find these accidents must also come about in time. They often expressed this by the dictum that what is not free of something that comes about in time itself comes about in time. This allowed them to conclude that all bodies, and by implication the whole world, have a beginning for their existence. Now, once the mutakallimun had proven that the world has entered existence, it was an easy last step to prove that the world was created by God. They simply asserted that what is originated requires an originator, for it is evident that things do not enter existence by chance, independent of a cause. So, here you go. This is, in a nutshell, how the mutakallimun proved that the world is created and that God is its creator. For the mutakallimun, it was evidently important not just to prove that the world depended for its existence on God. Otherwise, there would not have been any reason for them to refute groups who held that God's creation of the world was an eternal process, or that God formed and shaped the world from pre-existing matter or stuff. The mutakallimun wanted to prove that God created the world in a specific way, namely at a point in the past and from nothing. You might wonder why this particular conception of creation was of such importance to them. There are actually a number of reasons for this. To mention only one of them, they were anxious to draw a clear line between God and His creation, and the way in which they expressed the difference between them was by emphasizing that God was eternal and the world was originated in time. The mutakallimun feared that to say that God and the world were both eternal, even if the world existed only through God, would blur the lines between them and risk likening God to creation, in Arabic called tashbih, an arch sin according to the mutakallimun. But the mutakallimun did not just discuss the origin of the world and whether the world has entered existence at some point in the past or whether it has always existed. They actually zoomed in on the problem of creation and the creator and pondered over the following questions. Doesn't the Quran say that God is the creator of everything? So does this mean that literally everything, every single event in this world is brought about by God? And what does this mean for us humans? Are we then not the creators of our actions? You see, the theological problem of God's creation of the world had become something like the proverbial can of worms, which, once opened, required the mutakallimun to delve ever deeper into the ocean of Kalam, argumentation and debate. But this story has to wait till the next episode of the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by MacLeod. Thanks for listening, and hear you soon.